Hey friend, Colin here from Sumthins Recording. Today I'm going to show you how to mix saxophone, and we're going to look at some easy tricks for getting a massive sound inside the track. Let me start by playing you the saxophone inside the finished mix here, and then I'll solo it up. You can hear what it sounds like by itself as well. So here's our finished mix for this song. You can hear the saxophone has a massive, you can hear the reverb trailing off there as well. It has a massive presence inside the track here during the solo section, but it's not muddy and it's not harsh in any way. That's what we're trying to achieve here. We want to get a big sound out of the saxophone without it getting muddy in the midsection there and without it getting harsh up on the top end. So let me take all the plugins off here and we will walk through building this sound piece by piece here. Here's our raw saxophone, no processing on it. So the first piece of the puzzle, I'm sure you can probably guess, is a high-pass filter here. It's something I do pretty much first on everything I'm mixing. I want to clean up the bottom end here. Especially with something like saxophone, it's very similar to tracking a vocal, right? It's a wind instrument, so they're blowing into it. You're going to get some low-end air blasts coming out of the saxophone. We want to roll off the bottom end and negate all of that low air coming off the sound hole, coming out of the saxophone. And because it's such a loud instrument, we want to make sure there's no low room resonances leaking into our recording here. So the first thing we're doing here is a high pass filter. I've got it rolled all the way up to 281 hertz here, 12 dB per octave slope. Take a listen here without the high pass filter and then with it. You can hear it's not making a huge difference across the entire sound of the saxophone, but it cleans up our bottom end and gives us a little bit of safety so we can boost down there later without bringing up any low-end rumble or low-end air blasts coming off of the saxophone. So that's our first step there. The next thing we're doing here is I want to compress it. Once I make sure there's nothing going on funky in the saxophone frequency-wise, I want to bring in some compression. And for me, I like to compress saxophone very similar to how I would compress vocals. So I'm pulling in this 1176 style compressor, the FET comp from Studio One. I'm running the attack at 0.55 milliseconds there, so pretty quick, and then a 50 millisecond release, fastest release for this unit, 4:1. We're going to give it about 5 dB reduction here. I'm not going as aggressive as I would with a vocal because a saxophone is typically more aggressive than a vocal is to start with, so I don't need to impart any aggression or character. I just want to use the fast attack and fast release times of this compressor to level out the saxophone similar to how I would level out a vocal. So here's without the compressor, and then I'll kick it in here. So it's working similar to how we want to keep a vocal in your face here. During the saxophone solo, we want to keep the saxophone up front. We want to keep it on top of the track. So that 5 dB reduction here we're doing with the 1176 is really helping to make sure this is sitting right where we want it. So when our vocal dips out and it cuts to the saxophone solo here, we want the saxophone to fill that void that the vocal was sitting in previously. Now, the next thing we're doing here, once we've got the saxophone evened out volume-wise, I want to introduce a little bit of bottom end. So we rolled off the bottom end to make sure there's no low-end rumble, no low-end air blasts. We're compressing it to get it even volume-wise. Now we can boost up any low fundamental we have there to give the saxophone some weight and make sure it feels big inside the track. I don't want it to come in feeling thin or small or anything like that. So we're at 200 hertz here and I'm boosting 3 dB. This is the lower end of where the saxophone is sitting here in this track. It's a tenor saxophone. So a little bit of this 200 hertz is just going to give it some bigness in the bottom end here. So take a listen without this boost and then with it. It's a subtle move. It's not making a huge difference, but it's adding that subtle bit of fullness to the bottom end of our saxophone. So when we do our reverb, when we do our final bit of processing here and we push it out front in the track, it's not feeling thin or just harsh up on the top end. It actually has some low end fullness, so it feels big inside the rest of the track. Now, our next thing here is our reverb. And yes, I'm adding the reverb directly onto the track here. So you can see it's actually a mono recording, so a mono recording of the saxophone, just put the mic up there on it. But I've switched the track here in Studio One to a stereo track. So when I put the reverb on, it's going to spread the saxophone wide, and we're going to get a massive sound out of it. This is how we're making it feel massive inside the track. Changing the track to a stereo track and putting a stereo reverb on it, and then mixing it directly on. It's going to give our saxophone a ton of depth here, and it's going to make it feel really, really massive, like it's in some giant room here. Take a listen. Takes it from being, you can hear it trailing off there. It's a very long plate reverb. It's almost 6.5 seconds here. It's just the flat plate here from the Studio One room reverb, and then I've dialed it up to about 6 seconds. The mix is dialed back to 25% there directly on the track, but it takes it from being this dry and small sounding saxophone solo to something that's massive and that's going to draw your attention inside the mix here. The final little thing we're doing here, besides the mix tool, I'll talk about the mix tool at the end of the chain here in a second, is just a little bit of EQ at the end of the chain to make sure it's not too harsh. All the little moves we've done along the way, make sure when you throw the reverb on, it feels big, it has that bottom end, but it's not messy sounding. Once I threw the reverb on, I felt it needed just a touch more cleaning up on the top end, so I'm rolling in a low-pass filter here at 15K, 12 dB per octave slope, and it's just making sure, post the reverb, there's no harshness and there's no funny business up on the super, super highs here. So take a listen without the low pass, and then I'll kick it in. It's not trimming off a whole bunch of top end here, but just enough that it's not feeling too harsh. You can see up until these last couple plugins here, we're mixing the saxophone very similar to how I would mix a vocal, right? Starting with an EQ and getting rid of the frequencies we don't need, then pulling in our compressor and compressing it for tone and to get it even inside the track, and then of course boosting bottom end post-compression where I would on a vocal. Adding the reverb directly on the track that's where we depart from the vocal mixing techniques here. This is something to get this sounding massive inside the track, and then rolling off top end is not something we would normally do with vocals either, but with a saxophone, all of our energy sitting here in the high mids, 1K to 5K. We don't need anything up 7, 8, 10K. All of that's where it's going to get harsh and pokey for the listener, so adding just this touch of safety at the end of the chain. The mix tool here I've got at the end of my plugin chain here is actually my version of doing automation on the saxophone here. So if I turn on our automation lane, it's just throwing this mix tool on during the saxophone solo here, and then the saxophone solo on the outro. I don't like moving the fader. I like being able to have access to the fader whenever I want, to bump it up, to bump it down, to set it wherever I want it. So whenever I do any kind of volume automation, I like to just throw a mix tool on and then automate the mix tool on and off here. So if you look here inside the track, I'll throw it back inside the track, this mix tool turns on when we get to this section here. So you can see it's bypassed, and then when we get to the solo, the mix tool kicks on and bumps our saxophone up about 2.5 dB here.
Chicago, we're crying for you. Magnificent man.
And then our solo ends, and The mix tool kicks back off, sets the saxophone back in the track so it's not overstepping on the vocal. Like I said, I just do this because I like the freedom of being able to grab the fader whenever I want, and this gives me a little bit more freedom than actually automating the actual volume fader does, because even on the solo, if I want the solo louder, I can just open up this mix tool and kick it up rather than having to pull up and down different automation lanes. So that's all of our processing. Take a listen one more time and I'll A/B all of our plugins here inside the track. It looks like a lot of plugins, but very subtle moves on each thing to get this saxophone feeling natural, but feeling massive inside this track.
My Chicago, crying for
Easy tricks here for getting a massive sound on saxophone. The first thing we're doing, rolling off any bottom ends, so any kind of low end air, low end rumble coming from the saxophone. Then we're compressing it, very similar to how we would compress vocals here. Fast attack, fast release to even it out, keep it up front inside the track here. Boosting bottom end post compression to make sure the saxophone feels full and it's not thin sounding up on the top end. Then we're adding our reverb here directly onto our track, 25% on the mix. This is what's making our saxophone feel massive inside the mix here. Then just rolling off a touch of the top end to make sure it's not harsh inside the track. It can get brittle up on the top end, so we want to add a layer of protection against that. And then the mix tool on the end is my version of doing automation to make sure the solo sections sit up front inside this track. I hope that was helpful for you. If you're looking to go a little bit deeper into the mixing process, you want to see every piece of the puzzle and every step along the way in a mix situation, then I have just the thing for you, and it is completely free. If you click the link in the description, you can get instant access to multiple sets of multi-tracks completely for free, along with video workshops that go with each set of multi-tracks, so showing you how I would mix that song from start to finish. I want to take all the mystery and all the guesswork out of mixing for you and help you get professional sounding mixes right from your home studio. Thank you so much for watching here today, and I will see you in the next video.